Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Governor Live. It is Thursday, the 25th of May, 2017. And in this session in our Governor Live series that's running through the spring and summer terms, I'm joined by Michelle and Darren from Berg, law firm based in Manchester, and we're going to be looking together tonight at leading or joining a mat and some of the legal issues around there. If you've been here before, you will have probably seen Michelle, but Darren's here with us for the first time, and we'll explain their background and what they're doing here at the moment. What I'm going to do is just go through some housekeeping so that you can feel, if it's your first time, and for many of you it is, you can feel confident about what we're doing. So the first thing is that we can't hear you, and it's quite possible that our video might pause at some point like this. So you should, in that case, still be able to hear our voice, but it may be that our video is paused. Don't worry, there's no problem. It's just sometimes makes more sense to stop the video than it does to keep it going, but we will probably keep it going for as long as we can. If someone in your household, assuming you're at home, is using Netflix or the iPlayer or some other internet-intensive activity, then maybe ask them if they can to go outside if it's sunny and enjoy the garden or enjoy the sky or something while you get on with this. Because it's, as I always say this every week, I'll say it again, if everyone in the house turns on the taps at the same time, it's very slow to run a bath. In a similar way, if everybody is doing something on the internet and you're trying to do this, your quality of your experience might go down a little bit. We are recording this event, and it will be available to view as soon as possible. The note about last week, we weren't able to get the recording made. There was a couple of issues with that, but I have looked at it today, and I think it's we're going to be probably able to get it out tomorrow or immediately after the bank holiday weekend, which I know is what I said last week. But assuming this goes well tonight and doesn't require a load of work, we'll all be fine, and hopefully they'll be out at the same time or one immediately after the other. If you've got a question as we go, Michelle and Darren are going to be doing some presentations talking about some of those legal issues. But please do preface it with a Q and direct it to the person whose maybe point has sparked the question in your mind, or if you've brought a question, you can ask it now, as Phil has already done. But if it's something to do, for example, with land and property, it'll probably be for Darren. If it's something to do with governance or employment, that'll probably be for Michelle. So do preface it with a Q for whomever, and I will collate those all together, and I will shortly after the presentations we'll have a dedicated time to answer questions, so don't worry if they don't immediately turn to it. It may be they jump in, which is fine, but we generally go into them in a bit more depth afterwards. We do aim to conduct ourselves as we would in a governing body meeting, which means the appropriate discretion in terms of what we talk about. You may be in a situation of joining a mat, and you may be unsure about something, and you're asking a question about that. You will see from when you type in your name, so Phil has typed in his name, I don't know Phil's surname, and one of the reasons for that is that it is possible with Edubase and with the ability to Google, school governor, someone's name, to find out which school you're in. And obviously, if you're a bit of an awkward situation, that's one of the reasons we're kind of stripping out the surnames. But in terms of things that you're sharing, despite that, do please bear in mind, the thing I often say is imagine that you were discussing something with another governor at the school gate or outside the school office when parents were around. How would you phrase that if you were discussing something sensitive? So maybe think about that. Everybody does every week, and it's all brilliant, so I wouldn't worry at all. So tonight's presenters, if you've been to Governor Live before, you've almost certainly met Michelle Gray. She's the an employment partner and head of education at Berg, based in Manchester. And she's also vice chair of a school that's in a mat and trustee of a charity that looks after, supports folk with mental health issues. Her email is there. We will probably put hers and Darren's email into the chat box later if there's any more questions to come up with. Michelle has led lots of the sessions that we've had recently, did one on the competency framework last week, and was also involved in the considerations for conversion series that we did in the autumn term. The recordings of that are on the Governor Live site, and they're like an expanded version of what we're doing tonight, and she might touch on that in a little while. Darren Ashworth joins us for the first time tonight. He's a commercial real estate associate at Berg, again based in Manchester, and has previously been a land and development team leader at LA, and he'll explain the sort of work he does, but typically acts for LAs and academy trusts when it comes to conversion, and his email address is there as well. So in a moment, I'm going to switch over to Michelle and hand the reins over to her if you like. I will stop my video and concentrate on collating any questions. And if you've got any questions as we go, please don't wait till the end. Do ask them. And when they're on your mind, just ask them. I will make sure I get them all, and then we'll go through them quite systematically at the end. You're more than welcome to comment on what somebody else has said. You don't have to wait for one of us to do that. And please do treat this as if you were just in a room with other governors at a briefing or something like that, and you're finding out where they are. That's absolutely fine. You don't all have to be silent while Michelle and Darren are presenting, but do obviously, reflect on what they're doing. So I will hand over to Michelle. I will stop my camera, and we'll switch over to where she is.
Thanks very much, Ian. Good evening, everybody. As some of you may know from last year's session, we spent a bit of time going through the conversion process, and we felt there were quite a lot of questions around particularly property land issues that my colleague Darren is here this evening to go through some more of those issues in detail, answer some of your questions. So if those of you who were watching last year, you may have heard some of this evening's session, but for those of you who are new to Mon Governor or who didn't catch the previous sessions, I will be going through some of it in this evening in some detail. There will be a focus, as there is with the DFE, on leading or joining a MAT. So if you're maintained, or you haven't yet converted, or you're sat looking to join a MAT, then we will touch on some of those issues this evening. So as Ian said, we act for different types of schools when they're looking at converting, either the initial conversion to a single academy, or if they're looking at setting up their own MAT, or joining a MAT. And one of the most complicated areas in the conversion process, if you've gone through it yourself, you'll know, are the land issues and property issues. So I'm going to go through the sort of foundation of the conversion, and then I'll pass over to my colleague Darren, who will take you through some of the detail around the land matters. We are going to touch on the actual status of a trust, and we're also going to look at the people, so what happens with the staff. So most of you will probably be aware, in terms of an academy, it's obviously still publicly, it's still maintained from this perspective of it's government funded through the Education Funding Agency, but the local authority is not involved post-conversion, and with that comes a lot of freedoms for academies, which is why it has become attractive as an option to consider. It is, in terms of its status, it's a company limited by guarantee. It doesn't need to be registered as a charity, but it will need to comply with many of the charity rules. As I said, it's independent from the local authority, which means that when it comes to curriculum, school terms, staff, terms and conditions and admissions, then there's freedom around those areas. The penultimate bullet point on financial freedom, my business associate, really, Karen Ray at Armstrong Watson, for those of you who listened to her sessions last month, spent a lot of time going through the finances of an academy, because it's absolutely vital when you are looking at conversion that you understand the financial aspects of running what is effectively a business, albeit not for profit. So you do have to understand the detail. It's absolutely critical when you're looking at considering converting. If you're already an academy and looking at joining an academy, or indeed if you're a MAT looking at growing, as governors you will be subjected to a lot of figures if you're perhaps trustees of the MAT, you will be very familiar with looking at strategy for growth, and it's key that financial aspect of it is forensically examined. So the final point Darren will touch on in more detail, but the typical position, if the land is owned by a local authority, is that a lease is provided, normally for 125 years. But Darren will touch on a few of the other details in relation to the property. So the actual conversion process, the mechanics, is fairly prescriptive in that you need to register your interest with the DFE, and then before formally applying for an academy order, your governing body has to pass a resolution, and that, if you haven't yet converted, is really a key point at which the governing body need to be in a position where they understand the implications, they're all in agreement for moving forward, and there is a strategy in place in terms of the reasons for conversion, how it's going to benefit the pupils, the education. Perhaps there's resources that you're looking to collaborate on with other schools, and that is one of the key benefits of converting. But the list is endless when you are coming to consider why your particular school should convert. And as part of that process, the governing body does need to be engaged in it in order to pass the resolution. So once the application has been submitted, if that's approved by the head teacher board, you will then have to go through the process of setting up the trust, which involves incorporating the company, and the transaction, what we regard as the transactional documents, which covers certain funding agreements. So if you're a school looking at joining a MAT, there will be in place a master funding agreement, and then each school will have a supplemental funding agreement. There's also other documents included, such as the commercial transfer agreement, where all the effectively the contracts and the assets transfer over. And as I said before, the local authority typically provide a lease in terms of the land. So I touched on, in terms of the incorporation a moment ago, the incorporation documents. This does include appointing trustees, which, if you're familiar in sort of business terms, they are effectively the directors of the business. You then have members, which are akin to shareholders of a company, and you typically have a minimum of 3 trustees and around 3 to 5 members. And typically the trustees are often made up of the head teacher, or depending on how large you are, there may be a chief executive involved. But that is one of the key areas that you really need to be, you need to have the information when you're putting in your application to convert, so you know who are going to be the trustees. They will have a key role. And for those that perhaps caught my session last week, or if you didn't, it will, as Ian said, be available on the recording hopefully next week. I did go through in some detail the areas, responsibilities and duties of the trustees, which are set out in the competency framework and the new handbook. So just to focus a little bit on joining an existing MAT, it's very similar to the conversion process. As I say, there will be a master funding agreement in place, and each school would have a supplemental funding agreement. And if you are a single academy joining a MAT, then the existing single academy will need to be wound up as part of the process. So I touched on a few of the benefits earlier on why you would look to join a MAT. And if you are at that stage where you're deliberating and considering the benefits, I think it's also important to look at, and I've put a few of the benefits on the slide, but it's also important to look at what the disadvantages are. And often one of the areas where people are very nervous is losing control. And that is really what I come on to in terms of looking particularly at joining a MAT, is ensuring you're conducting due diligence on the school that you are joining, particularly around the scheme of delegation that will be in place. So by that I mean as a MAT, depending on how many schools you have and depending on their performance, it's typical for the trustees to set out a scheme of delegation whereby certain duties and responsibilities are delegated down to each individual school, and that particular governing body or committee, as some schools are referring their local governors to, and it's important to understand how that scheme works so that you can understand the decision-making powers that you may have as an individual school. I've set out some other questions you really need to be looking at if you're joining a MAT, in terms of the values and how it's going to work, how that relationship, that marriage is going to work. I think the going back to the issue of financial stability is key if you're joining a MAT. You really want to know what the next 5 years of growth is going to look like. Is the MAT looking at different areas geographically, or is it going to spread out in specific hubs? What size of school? How many pupils? All of those issues are going to be relevant, and it's key at the early stage before decisions are made and it's too late to go back. So it's key for you to understand the makeup of the MAT that you're joining. So in terms of leading a MAT, if you're looking at setting up a MAT and you're going to be the lead school, then there are certain criteria that you need to be looking at, certainly to satisfy the RSCs in terms of your vision and strategy, particularly around the standards and performance of the particular schools that you're perhaps looking at approaching. I'm just conscious of time, so I apologise if I'm cantering through it. I do want you to spend some time with listening to Darren going through the property matters. So I've mentioned members, and I think it's just important to understand, if you are looking at who your members are going to be of an academy, that they really are the shareholders of a company. They have the long-term interests of the trust. They're not as involved as the trustees or the governors are going to be, but they have certain powers, and those I've set out on the slide in relation to appointing and removing trusts. Can everyone hear me okay? I've just noticed. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So members have some legal responsibilities, certainly in terms of the powers over the trustees, which is their main one of their main responsibilities. They're also the legal owners of the trust. I think it's also important to point out that as far as the legal status is concerned, it's the trust that is the legal body. Each school, if it's a match within that trust, doesn't have any legal status. So trustees are just continuing on from that. They have more responsibility overseeing the management and operations of the trust. They are the key decision makers who make those key decisions, particularly around the scheme of delegation. So I touched on a few of the documents that are required. If you are a MAT, there will be a master funding agreement and supplemental funding agreements for each academy. Most of the documents are produced by the DFE in a model form. Some authorities will adapt them. It depends on the particular authority, but it is important if you are looking at going through the process to have legal support to advise you on those documents, what their implications are, and if there are obviously any changes, deviations from the model form, you can seek guidance on that. As I mentioned before, there's also a commercial transfer agreement which transfers effectively the contracts, the supplier agreements, and also deals with the assets. So just touching briefly on staff, the TUPE regulations, which some of you may be familiar with, that acronym, it stands for the Transfer of Undertakings, Protection of Employment. What those regulations do is ensure that all employees who are employed immediately prior to the school converting are transferred over to the new trust, which is a new employer, and they preserve the terms and conditions of staff, including length of service. The point I mentioned earlier about academy freedoms is obviously subject to the limitations in TUPE, which does restrict certain changes from being made, which time doesn't permit me to go through that in detail, but I'm happy to ask any questions. But most conversions, the staff go over without any changes. There may be some minor administrative changes, but generally it's business as usual. So with that, I'll pass over to Darren, who can talk you through some of the areas in relation to the land.
Okay, so good evening again, everybody. I'm presuming that everybody can still hear me. As I mentioned earlier, my name's Darren Ashworth. I'm a commercial property solicitor at Berg. Tonight I'm going to run through briefly, because there's a lot to get through and not very much time, but briefly run through some of the land issues that can arise on an academy conversion. Just seeing this, the sound is quite low out. So, first two fundamental questions to consider are the extent of the land that's going to be transferred as part of the conversion, and then also who currently owns the land and how is it going to be transferred on to the Academy Trust. Taking the first point, the DFE expects that most schools will transfer exactly as they are. The logic behind that is that it should be a seamless process really for the pupils and the staff. However, there have been instances that I've seen on a few matters I've worked on where the plans provided by, say, the local authority aren't necessarily in line with what the trust was expecting to receive in terms of the red line edging for the site. So it is very important to check the plan carefully and to ensure that the trust liaises with the legal advisors to raise any comments or concerns. Taking the second point, who owns the land, which feeds into another question, the third bullet point there, what will the tenure type be? Will it be freehold or leasehold? Now, this really depends on the type of school. And I think Lynn raised a question earlier about a voluntary aided school, which would be one of the types in question. And I'm sure, as everybody knows, that the majority of the schools in England are community schools and they're owned by the relevant local authority. They tend to be the most straightforward cases from a land and property perspective, in that the DFE expects that the sites will transfer by way of a lease. There's a prescribed form lease, and the term is 125 years, and it's for a peppercorn, i.e. no rent is payable. The process is different, though, for different types of schools. So taking another example, foundation schools, which can have trusts, so they can be with or without trusts. Often the freehold title has already moved over to the governing body in those cases. So the end result is often a freehold transfer instead of a lease. All of this, I should say, though, does have to be, it is also site specific, and it has to be negotiated with the particular owner of the property in question. Taking the third main example of voluntary aided or voluntary controlled schools, most commonly those type of schools are church schools, and the land actually is often owned by a combination of different people. Quite commonly, I see that the school property is owned, for example, by the diocese, and the playing fields that relate to the school might be owned by a local authority. So different arrangements can apply to those cases, and often the local authority land may be leased as it would with a usual community school. In the case of the part of the property that's owned by the diocese, though, it's very different. I know that I think the Church of England has released a policy saying that it isn't happy to transfer by freehold or by way of lease the land that's owned by a voluntary aided or controlled school. So to cover that, the DFE has come up with a different set of model documents, which are referred to as a supplemental agreements. Now that's and it's actually goes into quite a lot of detail, but the end result is it passes on the ownership of the land to the trust without actually formally creating a lease or a freehold transfer. And there are different models of that supplemental agreement depending on whether it's a single academy trust or a multi-academy trust that will be taking the land. So moving on to the next question, we get to the point where the first main document has to be produced in the process from a property perspective, and that's the land questionnaire, which I'm sure people are familiar with. The first question on that actually requires the trust and its solicitor to fill out the current ownership details for the land and the arrangements for the expected transfer. So other questions will also become relevant there, though, and usually it requires a liaison with the school managers, with the school business managers, for example, to work out how things actually operate in practice. But the current owner of the site will also have to input as well to provide some of the details. So the other questions include, I've got a list here, shared use and how shared uses will continue post-conversion, whether any building works are planned, whether there are any warranties in place for those building works, which I'll touch on briefly later, whether there are any sports or leisure facilities that are owned by community groups, that may lead to other questions as to arrangements for staff and income. And then finally, whether the school has a nursery or a children's centre attached to it. So the ideal scenario would be the ownership aspect being sorted out early on, the plan being agreed so that the extent of the land to be converted is agreed by both parties, and then the format for going forwards, whether that be a lease or a freehold transfer or the supplemental agreement, is also agreed. And then it's just a matter of moving things forward and actioning it to document all of that. So the next step then would be, and this is where the legal advice really becomes critical, is on the property due diligence process. Now, really, that process is no different to any other commercial land transaction, whether that be a transfer of an office, or whether that be a transfer of a commercial building, a retail shop or something like that. The principles are the same, and actually you can sort of relate it to the process of buying or selling a house as well. The only difference is that in those other types of commercial property transactions, the solicitors normally carrying out the due diligence, and that's to inform the purchaser about any issues affecting the property, whether that can impact on the price that the purchaser will pay, and ultimately whether or not they go ahead with the purchase if they find something horrendously difficult with the site. Now that's where it is slightly different on an academy conversion process. It's much more difficult to unpick a conversion when it's in full swing. So that does impact on some of the principles during due diligence as well. Moving on to the next slide. Here I've just set out the four main processes involved in a due diligence process for land. Again, you'll probably be familiar with some, if not all of them, even if just from residential property acquisitions that you've been involved in. So first is the review of the title or the deeds. We're quite lucky nowadays in that most school sites that we come across are registered at the land registry. So there is an official register there showing all the entries, the matters that affect and relate to the land, the rights that benefit the land and affect the land. They should all be stated on the register, and that's a public record available to everybody that can be downloaded from the land registry. In cases where the land registration process hasn't been completely completed, the site of the school may still be what we call unregistered, and in those cases it's much more important to pore over all of the old deeds and documents relating to the site. So it's a slightly longer and more cumbersome process, but the end result is the same. We're just trying to work out whether the site has all of the rights it needs to operate successfully as a school, and access, whether that be access or utilities, and also that there isn't anything majorly onerous affecting the site that could impact on the trust going forwards. I should say that because the school, the managers are there, and generally with a school, the occupation has been ongoing for several years, the likelihood of finding something, i.e. that the site isn't accessible, or there's a ransom strip preventing access, or that there isn't a utility connection is pretty slim, but we still need to check. Second point is a physical inspection, and again, as you might see on a residential purchase, when you have a surveyor look around the property and provide a building survey, it's a very similar process. It's not a legal job, but it's something that we as lawyers we recommend. It's really for peace of mind, to make sure that the school's in a decent condition and there won't be any major surprises or major areas of expenditure or dangers even it could be asbestos, or the presence of asbestos and a proper management report in place for that, or it could be simply the structure of the building, faulty works. It's always recommended that you have an independent professional opinion on that. On that point, taking the example of the lease, which is the most usual form of transfer to an academy, that does provide that the trust is only responsible for making good any deterioration in condition or damage occurring after its ownership. So it shouldn't catch historic issues. But again, there is a need to be careful, because the legal arguments can become quite sophisticated there on either side to push it one way or the other. Third bullet point there is raising inquiries of the current owner. Here it can be a bit of a lucky dip, if I'm honest with you. Some local authorities are really helpful, taking the example again of the standard case where the local authority is the owner. They'll provide lots of answers to questions. They'll be heavily involved in the process. Others are more reluctant, and that can elongate the process slightly, and again make it a little bit more difficult, because for us as lawyers acting on the deal, we need the information to be able to advise you on what that means. If we don't have that information in the first place, it makes our job a little bit more difficult. Having said that, though, the school, I go back to the school managers, but the people that are already there, they usually have the practical knowledge, and sometimes their knowledge is more beneficial than that of the owner, the local authority, who's slightly removed. So really, we get round to asking the key questions in the end, and again, that usually it's very rare that you find something absolutely fundamental. So I'm noticing that time is ticking on, so I will I'll try and counter through the remainder without taking up too much more of your time. Last major part of the due diligence process is the searches there, the fourth bullet point. Now, the typical cost for a basic package of searches on a school property would be anywhere between £500 to £1,000. For those who don't know what searches are, they're searches that are carried out with third parties to ascertain the sort of rights, benefits and problems affecting the site. So typically we would have a coal ground stability search, we would have a drainage and water connection search, we'd have a search at the land registry, which picks up on what I was mentioning earlier on. We'd have flood and environmental risk searches. And there's a whole range of other things that we could search depending on the area and the location of the property. On this, though, I do come back to my initial point, and it's really for the trust where the trust has to get involved and make a commercial decision really on the cost benefit analysis. I mean, as lawyers, we'd have to recommend that searches are necessary, and that if you proceed without obtaining searches, that the site might be subject to unknown issues, which could present a risk going forwards. However, it can be quite expensive, and because it's not like a normal property deal where the purchaser can just pull out, all of that has to be weighed and balanced to come to a decision on whether the searches are ordered. So the final slide. You've carried out the due diligence process. What kind of issues would it typically raise, and how would you tend to deal with them? So the first thing I mentioned there is a concept that again people have probably come across, but it's buyer beware. It's a principle of the English property law system that the onus is on the buyer to make sure that it checks everything. It's not on the seller to disclose. The buyer has to ask the right questions. So the key point there is that land issues can be complex. So certainly please don't leave property as a last minute thought. It's there can be some pretty fundamental issues to work through. You may find that there are existing rights affecting the property, rights of way, service access, as I mentioned, they can be onerous. Chances of finding them are rare, are slim. Sorry, and insurance is always available as a back option. Staying with rights, making sure that the school's got all the rights that it needs to run. Rights over neighbouring land, again, coming back to access, use of sports fields, shared use of any facilities, classrooms, if there's a neighbouring primary school, for example, parking. You could, the list could go on. Repair, responsibility for defects. I mentioned earlier the lease provision on that. That's where the survey and the inspection is pretty critical. And that feeds into the next point, which is collateral warranties for works. So if there have been some pretty important works recently in the few years preceding the conversion, the contractor would have directly contracted with the owner of the site as to the quality of those works, and the collateral warranty is passing the benefits of those warranties on to the new owner, i.e. the trust. Shared use arrangements, they should have been identified early on in the land questionnaire. Need to work out how they're going to be documented. You might need a separate shared use arrangement. You particularly need to pay attention to any income that's received and how that would be shared and passed on. And also if the local authority is retaining any rights. Funding consents, typically we come across Sport England or the Football Foundation. They might have given a grant to the school. And there'd be a restriction on title requiring that their consent is obtained to any transfer. And really running out of time at the end here, but on the final point I'd put down was any site-specific issues that might occur. Again, a typical one is caretakers' lodgings. Quite a few schools still have residential properties attached to them that caretakers typically tend to occupy at a less than market rate. They may have fallen into disrepair. Academies don't want to have to take on the responsibility for those lodgings. So often they're carved out of the site. But again, there are a number of issues to work through with the local authority, and it feeds into employment points. So that's that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot to get through, and I'm sorry if I was going very quickly towards the end. It's an involved process, but the issues are very similar depending on whether you're joining or setting up a trust. If you've done it before, the prior knowledge can be invaluable. So thank you for listening, and I'm sure Michelle and I will be very happy to.
Thank you ever so much, Darren. That's really helpful, and somewhat intimidating in some ways if you've not looked at this before, but it's important to know about all of those details. Now, I've collected some questions, and what we're going to do is, folks, if you've got any further questions about anything that Michelle or Darren have said, then do pop them into the chat box and I will pick them up. I'm just going to go over here now and paste in the questions that have come in so far. And maybe if we start at the top, Darren, if you'd like to maybe start with number one, Lynn's first question, and then we'll work our way down and I'll add any ones that come in as we're going to the bottom, if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you for that, Lynn. So the implications for voluntary aided schools. So voluntary aided schools are typically tend to be church schools, and as I mentioned briefly during the presentation, that there does tend to be a bit of a mix of ownership on some of those sites. Typically playing fields might be retained in the ownership of the local authority, and the school itself might be owned by a diocese. Now, the trust arrangements in place can complicate matters, and on this type of conversion, it can become a bit more convoluted, and there are a few more difficult questions to answer than there would be on a typical straightforward lease with a local authority. But for that reason, the DFE has produced some standard documentation. There are supplemental agreements, one for a Academy Trust and one for a single. which are designed to convey the property in a way that satisfies the church's requirements in terms of keeping the value of the site, but also allowing the conversion to go ahead, occupied appropriately.
Thanks, Darren. I think your sound dropped off just at the end there a little bit. Can I just add something to that in terms of VA schools? I'm a governor, I'm a vice chair in a VA school. We're not yet part of a MAT, and this is just, it doesn't mean anything. Please don't take it as being binding or anything, but have a discussion with the diocesan MAT talking about, and various people in the diocese, the issue that we found out, and I didn't realise this, and I was completely, allegedly know a little bit about governance, and they said the biggest issue about converting for most church schools is the land. And the reason was that if the land that it's on is owned by the diocese or something like that, part of the remit for having the land is to provide a Christian education. So the issue there is a church-based education, if you end up being part of a MAT that isn't a church-based MAT, isn't a diocesan MAT or something like that, and the trustees change and the members change in the direction, you may actually end up in a position where because of the ethos of the MAT, I think Michelle mentioned this, the land isn't being used to perform that function. And there was, at worst, and Darren can tell me this is rubbish or not, but there might actually, ironically, be a notice to quit given eventually if it turned out the land wasn't being used to provide a distinctly Christian education, which made the hair I've got stand on end, which was, I hadn't considered that at all. May not be valid. But is there anything in that, Darren, or am I barking up a tree?
No, you are. That's where the sort of the original trust arrangement can come into it, and it's very important to pour through all of that during the due diligence. The charitable or purposes of use of the land that the trust has originally dictated generally do have to be complied with. Whether there could be a notice to quit, termination, I think that would be a very, very difficult argument to make out, but it's certainly something that needs to be negotiated through the agreements of that supplemental agreement for the transfer.
Michelle, the next question is also from Lynn. Is it considered, and you've kind of answered this, but maybe just to briefly summarise it, is it considered appropriate to have the chief exec, the CEO, on the board to which he or she is accountable? And Lynn says she hears conflicting advice.
Yeah, so the answer that I gave in the box was, it's not something that I've come across where I've seen that it's been frowned upon. I'd be interested to see or hear or read what stories people are aware of. It's just part and parcel of the school to have the head, the executive head, or the chief exec who is part of the trust board, because it's looking at the question of strategy. I don't see how that role could not be on the trust board, albeit it's obviously that role is still subject to rigour, probity, and the questions that the other trustees will be raising. So I would be very interested to hear what stories people have read about chief execs it being frowned upon to be part of the trust board.
Okay, and next.
Should I go on to the next question?
Yeah, do that. Go through those.
Yeah. For Hayley, yeah, I'll have to get hold of it, but there was something that came out in January along with all the other documents about governance for MATs and Ofsted, and who they would be speaking to in MATs. But clearly the Ofsted starting point is going to be a chief exec or similar role as a starting point, and then that there'll be a filtering down. But I'll get hold of that information and we can send it out, Ian. It's quite a lengthy document.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I did respond to Hayley on the members. The articles will govern that in terms of appointing members and for members to be removed. So again, it's going back to the constitutional documents of the trust.
Yeah, and I guess where Ofsted come.
I think I couldn't see.
I think also where Ofsted come in and they're looking at, obviously they don't do inspections of MATs at the moment, although they may inspect all of the academies in a MAT in a short space of time. The scheme of delegation will inform who they choose to speak to, because I think they will look at who is responsible. And my understanding, my vague recollection is, they will see by the scheme of delegation who is responsible, and they will talk to the responsible people. So if you are a local governing body or equivalent who's got a lot of things delegated down to them, they're more likely to have that kind of in-depth conversation than if you are something that has pretty much no powers at all.
Yeah, exactly. And they'll go to the senior leader. So that might be, the chair of the trustees initially, with the chief exec or the executive head, and to ensure that Ofsted understand the governance structure before they make any further approaches in the MAT.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I think we are. Lynn's just got one more question, which is a follow-up to what's already been said. Let me put this in there. Make it a wee bit bigger so you can see it.
Yeah, normally, Lynn, there's the chair of trustees would also be a member.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're just about done there for the moment. We're going to look at a couple of other things and just explain some very important information about the forthcoming, the next session, which is in 2 weeks' time. So thank you for your questions. We're going to nip back to here at the moment. And this comes back up. So if you're a subscriber to Modern Governor, you can get all of the competency framework that we talked about last week and that you will see in a recording very soon as part of your subscription. If not, there is a trial that you can go and have a go at. I might show you something in a moment. The new module on conversion is just coming out. Here's one other document that might be of interest to you. This is Berg's, for whom Michelle and Darren both work. This is a free handbook they've done, and we're referring to this in our conversion to Academy status module that's being updated soon. This is the free Academy conversion handbook by Berg, and it kind of goes through almost like a checklist of things you need to do if you're converting. I guess it's useful for everybody who's looking at it because it gives you an idea of the size, the scale of the task ahead of you and what you need to do. And also, if you look on the right now, you can click on the button just below the chat box and download that. But that's a free download. We'll put a link to this on the recording when it goes on the website. So I just thought I'd jump over and show you that. And again, as mentioned, when we update our conversion to Academy status module in the next few weeks, that will refer to that as well. So the next Governor Live is on the 8th of June. Now, good job nothing important is happening on that day, because imagine if you, hang on a minute, yes, there's probably something on that day that's happening. But actually, we set this date a long time before the Theresa May decided to hold an election, or her advisors decided to hold an election on that day. So we will be going ahead with this because safeguarding is so important, we can't really skip it, and it's difficult to reschedule with so many people signed up. So on the evening of the general election, you can step away from commiserating or cheering or whatever it is you're doing. And we're going to look at the legal aspects. Michelle's going to lead us in a session on the legal aspects of safeguarding for governance, really looking at what some of our responsibilities as governors are. And so we'll be looking at what is safeguarding, have a look at the statutory guidance, and really consider the role of governors in safeguarding. If you're a Modern Governor subscriber, I'd recommend that you look at the safeguarding modules we have, some introductory child protection ones, something that does cover the role of governors in safeguarding, and then come along with your questions. There are a whole bunch of modules. There's modules on, as you'd expect, in the current light of things, radicalisation, prevent, all sorts of other modules that we have around that. So do have a look at those if you're a subscriber. as it will kind of help you be really fully briefed for those. So that is the next one on June the 8th. We're currently on the 25th, and after that we've got one more session on June the 15th where Christine Bayliss will be on performing a SWOT analysis on your school. And actually, when you look at some of the questions that Michelle was asking earlier about how do you look at a mat and evaluate whether it's good for you or whether it fits you, what we're going to be doing there on that evening on the 15th of June is taking a real school, anonymised, looking at its data, its finances, its HR and its staffing profile, which local authority it's in, and again that will be anonymised, and then really helping everybody to look at this and say, how do we look at this school objectively when it comes to thinking about academisation or not? I think with all these sessions it's about making informed decisions whether you academise or whether you don't. So do come along to that. Book in for June the 8th on safeguarding, and the week after when we will have a different government, maybe the same one but different, maybe a completely different one, and a coalition or something like that. And then do click on that link, 2017 live, there to register for the final two. So we're going to make the recording available free. I'm promising that, and it will work, I hope, as soon as possible. If you've signed up for this, you will get a notification with a link to the YouTube channel. For the moment, I'd just like you to quickly spend a couple of minutes just doing some evaluations that help us plan for the future. We've already got lots of good ideas from other people's evaluations. So if you're able to just do these questions below where I am now, that would be really helpful. And if you've got any feedback about this evening, it helps us to improve. And if the second question on future topics, there are already some listed there which you should be able to see. So have a quick look through and see what's already there. And give us some feedback if you're able to. Michelle and Darren, if I could ask you just to put your email addresses into the chat box, the thoughtful Q&A, so that folk can contact you if they have any other queries. That would be really helpful. So if you can possibly just type that into the box, then we will they'll be able to catch up with you if they need to. Maybe it's something you didn't feel you could bring up now. It's an awkward situation for a governor. But yeah, if you're able to just give us any feedback, that would be really helpful. And we will stop shortly. I will formally close and say thank you for attending. And then I'll stop the recording and then I'll gently ask you to leave the room. So thank you ever so much for attending, folks, and we will see you hopefully again in a fortnight's time after any half term that you might be having, because governors don't really have half terms, but we sort of do by proxy. So yeah, thanks ever so much for attending. Thank you to Darren and Michelle for all of your hard work and contribution. And if you've got any queries, then Michael, Michelle, Michael and Lynn, the link will be in the recording. I will put it in a second. Or if you just Google, or other search engines are available, Berg Academy Conversion Handbook, you will find it, because it is there and it is a free document from Berg. But I will put a link into the recording as well, and it will probably be in the description of the YouTube recording as well. So thanks so much. I'm going to stop recording now, and we'll see you again.